So we're ready for our second panel, which is Newsroom Leadership, Ending Abuses of Power. And we're pleased to announce that Mary Louise Kelly is the moderator. She is the host of All Things Considered, NPR's flagship evening news program. Previously, she served as NPR National Security Correspondent. She is also a contributing editor at The Atlantic and the author of 2 novels, Anonymous Sources and The Bullet. We are also joined by Karen Miller Pensiero. She is the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, where she started as an intern, and where she has worked for her entire 30-plus years in journalism. Karen was appointed to this role last September after several years as editor of Newsroom Standards and many other newsroom and business side positions for the Journal. She is currently responsible for all newsroom operations, budget, and people, and for ensuring that the Journal has a world-class, talent-driven, and diverse newsroom. Karen is also a member of the advisory board for Press Forward, and in fact, quite a few members here tonight are as well, including Mary Louise Kelly. And our next, actually not our next guest, but I'll go through who the advisory board is with Press Forward in a minute. Alexi McCammond, is a political editor for Axios, covering the Democratic Party and the midterm elections. She previously worked as a news editor at Bustle, the leading website for millennial women, where she covered the 2016 election as well as how politics and policies affect young women. Andrew Morse is executive vice president and general manager of CNN Digital Worldwide. He's responsible for the network's global digital business, including editorial, product, technology, emerging platforms, business development, and partnerships. Until recently, Andrew also oversaw news gathering and editorial operations for the CNN USA TV network as well. Prior to CNN, Andrew was head of Bloomberg Television. Before that, he spent 15 years at ABC in a number of management and production roles domestically and overseas. Madhulika Sikka is an independent media consultant and also public editor at PBS. She has led news teams and newsrooms across platforms, including ABC News Nightline, executive producer of Morning Edition, and executive editor of NPR News and Mike.com. And our own Press Forward's Carolyn McGorty-Supple. She is a co-founder of Press Forward and a management consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton in the Silicon Valley office, where she is focused on innovation, cultural change, and technology. She began her career in news as a desk assistant at ABC News, and she received her master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, where she was a student fellow with the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. So we welcome them all.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for sharing your Wednesday evening with us. Here's the plan. We, as journalists, spend so much of our days, these last 6 months at least, tracking the arc of this Me Too story. A story for which many of our colleagues are now winning Pulitzers and Greaseys and all kinds of awards, which is fabulous. I want to focus the next panel, our final panel of the night, on a thread we were starting to hear emerge in our first panel, which is this: where are we in the arc of dealing with this in our newsrooms? How are we holding our industry to account? How are we holding our colleagues to account? How are we holding our bosses to account? And where does all this go next? How do we avoid all of this continuing to happen? Are we doing enough? Is it working? Are we doing too much? So that's where we're going to start. Welcome to you all. And I want to start right there with this nuts and bolts question of, in the 6 months since the Harvey Weinstein story broke, our newsrooms have all done something. At NPR, we are deep in mandatory harassment awareness training. I spent my Monday lunch break doing this. We have done a big internal investigation. We're trying all kinds of things. Some of it's working. Some of it we're not quite sure yet. Some of it actually people seem to be exasperated by. So I thought I would start by throwing it to the three of you on this end who are in the thick of this in newsrooms. Karen, what are you trying at the Journal that works? Or on the flip side, that so far it seems to be kind of a flop.
Right. Well, I started in this job 7 months ago, so just right as things were really unfolding.
Yeah.
As was mentioned before, I began as an intern, and so I think I grew up at the Journal thinking that my story must be everybody's story. And I think part of this for me in this job has been to realize that my story is my story. And that every woman and every other person in that newsroom has something different that they bring to the table and experiences that they've had with bosses and coworkers and peers. So the first thing that I've started doing now is that everybody who comes into the newsroom, whether that's our intern class that'll come in this summer or new employees, is very early on, have conversations with them that says, look, this is what I had in my newsroom. Let me tell you what your expectations should be of us. When you work at the Wall Street Journal, you should expect to be in a newsroom where your voice is respected. You should expect to be paid equitably, that your ideas are listened to, that it's a safe environment, right? What I learned actually from the first Press Forward event in January, which was so helpful to me, was that just the reminder, pointing out that it's the people who come into our newsrooms who don't have power, who are the most likely to have these problems. And so seeking them out as they come in and setting the table right away, and then saying, okay, here's who you talk to if we're not meeting your expectations. Every intern now has a buddy or a mentor, somebody outside their department.
And that's new?
This is new, starting this summer, so that there's someone else that they can speak with. All managers now in the newsroom have to go through the mandatory training to sort of understand what's acceptable and what's not. Trying to learn the language that we can all speak, right? That we haven't had to speak together before. So it's too early to tell what's working and what's not, but I do know that people are very comfortable speaking up. Some people have been very comfortable speaking about what's working and what isn't.
By just setting a baseline of, these are our expectations, this is what you can do.
And when something comes up, and it does, even in what I have always thought was my perfect newsroom, things come up, and you have to address them, and you have to investigate them, and you have to do it with a diverse peer group of people who can have that conversation and come to the right decision about what happens, and how do you communicate that.
Alexi, what are y'all trying at Axios?
Yeah, well, that's been the really interesting thing working at Axios in this time, because we are a startup. Yeah. And startups are not known for having the most robust HR departments or sophisticated guidelines. And we are in the thick of this Me Too movement, and we're reporting on it while we're addressing those things. And that's not to say that we don't have an HR department. We do, and the woman who runs that is wonderful. But you are sitting there confronting, what could we do more, right? We are a startup. That's not an excuse to have flimsy guidelines or resources. I know that after the Harvey Weinstein things have come out and the subsequent stories, we had a meeting and an open conversation at the newsroom, and we were, emailed the guidelines again. And I thought that was a step in the right direction, but it's certainly not enough. One, how many people are reading that, right? We can't track that. Two, how are they interpreting it, right? So I think conversations are really helpful. One thing that I have tried to do personally, being a young woman in the newsroom, a young woman of color, someone who has been in a leadership position, I try to be as transparent as possible with the younger women who come in. Luckily, at Axios, we have not had any instances of sexual harassment or misconduct, and I think that is something I'm very personally proud of. At the same time, I am keenly aware of how sexual harassment and misconduct are prevalent in the media industry. When you're networking, when you're meeting with a source, when you're out reporting a story, when you're interviewing someone, when you're at an event. And I've had young women in the newsroom talk to me about those things before they're getting coffee with someone, before they accept to get drinks with someone, after an event in which a man has been creepy or made a pass at them. And I've become a resource because even if it's not happening in our newsroom, it's happening in our industry. And those people could either end up in our newsroom, they could end up in another newsroom, you could continue to have to work with them. And so that's something that I've tried to take on for myself in this moment at Axios, is to be a resource to show young women, and even the older women in the office, that we have to be there for each other with these instances that are happening outside of our network.
That's really interesting, because I think at NPR, one of the things that we have discovered is the divides along generational lines are at least as deep, if not more, than on gender lines. And it's interesting, one other facet of being a startup is y'all skew younger than, I'm guessing, the Wall Street Journal staff does. You have fewer senior women, for better or worse, who bring their own history and can say, you know what, that actually is way out of bounds. I've worked in a newsroom for 40 years, never seen something like that.
Right. And we do have a number of women across the company at every level, and I think they are really instrumental. I consult them all the time when I have, an email that I'm unsure about, or an exchange with someone where I'm like, am I overthinking this, which is the worst question that we all ask ourselves all the time, or is this something I should actually be worried about? And I think that's really helpful in just creating a culture of compassion and understanding and transparency among the women at Axios. And that's something that I've even talked to my male bosses about, is creepy interactions I've had with men or that younger women in the office have had, so that everyone is on the same page and at least aware of it, even if it's not happening to them or happening at our organization.
And you mentioned the idea of going out and meeting with sources. That's the next thing that I have to tackle, right? To start having conversations more in the newsroom, because in the past I think it's been sort of, well, if you're a young woman or a young person and you're going out and you're doing interviews in certain industries, that there's just a certain game that happens. That's not a game that we want our reporters to have to play. And how do we have that conversation, which we have to have, and what's the right thing to do? What do you do if the head of the PR for a company that you covered, that there's the person who's the access to the chairman, to the access to the CEO, is inappropriate with you? If you call them out, what happens to your access at that company? What happens to you as a reporter and your reputation, and what stories you may get next?
Right, because you're still working even if you're not in the office. Andrew, how's this playing out at CNN? Things y'all have tried that have worked surprisingly well or surprisingly fallen flat?
So the thing to me that has been most interesting and most successful is the notion of intentional leadership. And it was referenced in the last panel that we tend to be reactive to these things, or we did as an industry. We wait until there's a problem, we address it. And for us, we've spent a lot of time with leaders and managers at different levels. And by the way, a lot of times we also think we focus on the top level of management. You say this has to be dealt with at the top. And really the most effective managers in changing culture, I think, are at the middle level and hands-on, and people who have the eyes and ears of the company. We're responsible for it at every level, but we've been spending more time listening, and we've been reaching out in different corners of the organization and having conversations that, frankly, I don't think we had several months ago.
Can you be specific? Like,
well,
what kind of conversations?
Yeah, and so what I was going to say, interestingly enough, exactly that, is that it's not just related to Me Too. I think you have to take the fact also that you touched on the generational issue. We're living through generational shifts in our newsroom. We're living through an existential battle for the business models that we live in, right? And all of our newsrooms are challenged because of Google and Facebook. We're living through crazy editorial times. And we as journalists tend to worry about the 6 inches in front of our face and what are we going to cover today. So nobody has time to sit and listen to issues. So the issues that we're hearing are from employees in different corners. We don't feel as empowered as we might be to speak up and be heard, whether it's about the kinds of issues we're discussing tonight or just, am I spending too much time stuck at my computer and I don't have time to get up and go to the bathroom? Different expectations that different generations have in the workplace that we may take for granted because of how we grew up that aren't necessarily the same. And if you don't stop and listen and lead intentionally with the idea of actually listening to what employees say, you don't really have a good enough grasp. And if you're doing that, I think you're probably less surprised about issues that arise because you understand what's in the water a little more.
You're reporting out what's happening in your own newsroom as much as you're reporting the news outside.
Totally, that's what it feels like. It literally is, when you sit across a desk and you speak to employees you don't necessarily get to interact with as much, you're reporting. And there's something really empowering about doing that, I think, to both the employees and to us.
Let me change gears slightly and bring Madalika and Carolyn in on this next question, which is this. Who should we be pushing to the next generation of leadership in our newsrooms? Who should we be promoting? And I ask because the typical answer you get back is, let's promote a lot more women, which, amen, like, absolutely. But as I've thought about this in recent months, and I've written about this, if you went looking for a building packed with empowered female journalists, you would hit the jackpot at NPR. We have more female anchors than men. All 4 of our biggest shows are run by female executive producers. And Madalika was one of them until a few years ago. The point being, just promoting women up ain't gonna be enough to fix this. Madalika?
I think that's true. I think that hiring more women might be seen as a quick fix without addressing the underlying cultures. Mm-hmm. And the leadership of an organization at the very top is really important. They are the culture carriers, and that has got to, move all the way down the company. The thing I've been struck by in our industry in the last 6 months, with all these kind of remarkable stories, actually what I think is a real lack of humility on the part of leadership of these organizations. I don't think that they've really stepped up to talk about how it's affected them, and I think they would actually get a little bit of respect if they confessed that maybe they were surprised about how bad it was. I think you've also got to look, as you're looking to hire and grow your leadership, this came up in the previous panel, a journalist gets thrown into a management job, and a lot of times they're the worst people to be managers. Mm-hmm. And it's a sink or swim. They're given no tools, no guidance, no management training. There's just an assumption that you'll sort of get it done. And I think you do need to be much more intentional about it. And if something good can come out of this, I think being intentional about how you want to create a company that reflects values that you care about and that you prepare people for that. It doesn't happen by magic or osmosis. And I think you really, as Andrew says, I think you have to be really intentional about the steps that you take
training
next.
up is a theme I hear emerging here. Carolyn, jump in on this question of
you
how we do that.
Right, you raise such interesting points because culture is set by leadership and who you choose to put into positions of leadership. So if you put into a position of leadership somebody who's a great reporter but doesn't treat their colleagues with respect, who screams and yells at them but is like does really good stories and makes really great television, then it sends a signal to the workplace that we value people who make really great television or write really great stories, but we don't really care about the rest of the workforce. That creates a lot of stress for the organization. And going back to the business model, I think at the end of the day, the business leadership is what's going to solve a lot of these challenges, because what creates lack of safety and trust that prevented women from coming forward, or men, because men experience harassment as well, or bullying, is a lack of safety and trust. And there's a lack of safety and trust in organizations where your business model is being disrupted. You don't have job security. There's a lot of hierarchy, which is newsrooms, right? Plus deadlines for pressure, long hours. And so until you really fix and crack those problems, I think there's never going to be trust and safety, and you need to be looking for the voices that are going to enable the success out of a team. Because there are no lone geniuses working in isolation in a lot of the organizations that are going to create innovation.
And I think one thing to add to that, I think particularly for broadcast, broadcast is reliant on a star system. And that has allowed a lot of what we now know about to happen. I guess I wasn't really surprised about any of the stories that broke, but the Matt Lauer story actually took my breath away just because it happened so fast, they moved so fast for a guy who was the tip of the spear of a $500 million franchise. And I think that we have to think about that star system that
So
we've
how do
created.
we? How do we change? That star system is alive and well.
I have a theory.
I
I have a theory that you have to start really dealing with people's behavior and encouraging a good workplace atmosphere from very early on. I have a theory that not every asshole becomes a sexual harasser, but every sexual harasser was probably an asshole. And if you let a little bit of behavior get by, then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And you should weigh that up. For those of us who've been in television, we know executive producers who are not screamers, and we know executive producers who are. And I've seen both of them be successful. But why do you have to have the screamer?
I love that you use the word asshole because that's come up a lot. And it's actually an academic term. There was a Stanford professor who wrote the no asshole rule. And so we've been thinking about that a lot at Press Forward because we want civility and respect, and it's important to have definitions.
What is the no asshole rule?
I think, so the no asshole rule is basically this idea that hiring them is more trouble and more costly than they're worth. that they end up costing their organizations even if they're really talented. And so you need to look for people who get the best out of others, like Andrew Morse, who's one of my bosses, one of my favorite people in the world, who is someone I worked with, not to like throw you in the spotlight, Andrew, but you are a good boss, and people should know that.
Thank you.
But I think the best definition of an asshole I've seen is somebody who treats those who they think can do something for them or they think are important more importantly than they think those who cannot. So they don't say hi to the intern or the desk assistant in the morning. They don't say hi to the person who takes out their trash. They're not nice to cab drivers or their waiters, but they're really nice to the star in the room and have a completely different relationship. And that to me is not only a huge indicator of how they're going to behave in the workplace, but also who they are and who their characters are. And that matters because journalists are individuals first. The people we go out and who we want to cover our stories in times of natural disasters or tragedy, or when we turn to them every day, there are voices, there are translators. They have to have good character. And for me, this whole moment has been not just about sexual harassment, but about abuses of power. And so who do we want leading our newsrooms who are supposed to hold the powerful to account if they don't have the character to protect their own staff and their own colleagues?
I think part of that too is just reflected in the general culture of who is in media and who is in places like Washington, D.C. It's a very transactional city, right? Being a journalist is a very transactional profession. You very much operate in a sense of, I have this, what can you give me for this thing that I have? Whatever currency you're operating in, it is almost always a transaction, and that's how you get ahead. And that's something that I'm reflecting on all the time personally is that's how we operate. How does that translate to these transactional instances in which there is sexual harassment or misconduct involved? You have these abuses of power, you have these situations where you have something to offer and you want something from them, right? And I think that plays a big part in it, and that's something that keeps me up at night because it's this cyclical thing and I don't know how we get out of it.
You raise the transactional nature of A, newsrooms, and B, really in Washington. That's the way the city works. About one of the things that is specific to newsrooms, the newsroom culture, which, as we know, thrives on deadlines. There's stories that get told in the NPR newsroom about people throwing phones at each other on deadline, and these stories are told with great fondness and warmth about, isn't this a great place to work? I love it. Let's tell the intern this new story. My point being, of course, not that any of us want to work in a place where there are jerks allowed to act like jerks. However, some of that, if I'm being brutally honest with myself, is what attracted me to want to work in a newsroom and not a management consultancy, was to be in the fray. And yeah, I'm gonna yell when I'm on deadline because I'm stressed out. How does that play into how we all navigate this going forward? Because we're coming from a certain culture where that behavior historically has been tolerated.
There's a difference.
Even embraced.
There's a difference when you see it, though, and I think there's a difference between the intensity of either a newsroom or the field. I was a field producer for a long time overseas covering wars and famines, and there's an intensity, or there's I, as a desk assistant, was yelled at over the phone and called an idiot and sworn at, and there's a difference. I had the good fortune of working with and for Madalika Sika and for Lynne Adrine and some wonderful bosses, and their cultures. Newsrooms are different even within the same organization. The Nightline was a perfect place where I really cut my teeth with the old Nightline, and it was a group where there was no yelling and there was no screaming, and it was understood that that's not the way things work now. That said, there were some pretty demanding people who, if you screwed up, they would let you know, but you felt really good about it, and you said, okay, I screwed up and I'll do better tomorrow. But it was meant to make you stronger. It was meant to encourage you and build you up, not to tear you down. Mm-hmm. And I think we all know the difference there.
And I think that intensity is something that I strive for as well, and something that attracted me to this profession as well. But I would argue that the last panel brought up the old boys network. Yeah. And that's probably where this is coming from and has been coming from for years. And we have to ask ourselves, if women had been in these positions of leadership for decades past, would that be the same style of newsroom that we were aspiring to work in?
I will say the phone throwing incident at NPR was woman throwing at another woman.
Yeah.
Well, then I'm done on this panel. I have nothing to offer.
But the fray is the fun part, right? The deadline stuff, but there are newsrooms exist that where it's not mean and it's not demeaning, And it starts well before the deadline conversation in the heat of the battle. It starts with pay equity, and it starts with how do you treat each other when there's not a deadline,
Exactly.
right? It's how do we have conversations. One thing that I tell all of the incoming folks at orientation when I talk to all of the people at the Journal at Dow Jones, not just in the newsroom, is you're part of the newsroom, right? I want them to understand that it takes everybody in the building to do what we do. So if you're in the mailroom and you're the guy who's supposed to deliver the FOIA documents to the reporter's desk, you are a valued part of the newsroom. And it takes every single person. And that's, I think, the culture that I'm trying to make sure that we maintain moving forward is that respect has to start from the moment you walk in, and how do you treat the most junior person, and not just how do you manage up, how do you manage down, how do you manage across, and how do we treat each other in those moments when it's not hot and nasty and the story's not quite right and the lead still sucks after you've rewritten it 16 times.
And I think also that if you do throw a phone at someone, that once you've hit mid-air, you apologize to them.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of that doesn't happen in the sort of screamy, shouty places. It's just kind of like you're, oh, this is the way I'm going to be because this is the way that's going to be successful for me. I think on the hiring front, when you think about who is your team, I think one of the challenges we really need to be careful of, and I've seen a lot of work on this, and I've seen it in action myself, when there's a real focus on numbers. Numbers isn't the only thing, and if you say to people, you've got to improve your numbers, so then someone will say, oh, well, look, I hired this woman who is also a person of color. She's a twofer. And, well, why have you hired her? Nobody asked that question. It's like, oh, she's come in, and we've got this person here. But they're expected to conform to the culture that's already there. They're not hired because of what they could bring to help change the culture. And I think that's often a mistake that happens. One woman isn't enough, 2 women isn't enough, 3 people of color isn't enough. You have to be open to the idea that everyone is going to bring something different. And if it just becomes a numbers game and nothing else, you have actually crushed that person who you hired who thought they were going to make a difference by being in a culture that actually they walk into a room and they're the only one. And it's like, oh, everyone else is behaving the same and I'm different. I can't do anything about that.
And the diversity hire question is not just about color of skin or LGBT or gender. It is about, it's where'd you come from?
Yep.
Did you go to a state school, a community college, or did you go to an Ivy? Are you from Idaho? Are you from Alabama? Are you from LA or New York? Because I want a newsroom where there are so many different voices. It helps us in our coverage. It helps us to find loaded language. It helps us in those things. But it also just brings, if you're hiring all from one place, whatever the culture was of that place, you're bringing right into your newsroom.
And being open to that experience that people bring. I mean, for the record, I would not hold it against Alison Stewart that she had never been a White House correspondent. In fact, I would think that's a plus. But we are not, especially in this city, we're not open to that, really. People are expected to follow a particular path. And it's really hard to get people to break out of those silos. And when you look at who's running things, I had this discussion with a bunch of very senior women this week who we all agree, actually the picture is worse now than it was 20 years ago. Every major organization, Diana listed all the networks that they went to meet, all run by white males. Every important, influential news organization is run by a man. In the case of the Times, an African-American man, the only one. It's kind of remarkable in 2018. And I don't know how we're going to change that.
I think it takes being really bold, and that's really hard to do. I'm someone who's extroverted and feels comfortable going to my bosses who are all white men and saying, and I'm lucky enough to have hiring decisions on the news team, and telling them, I want to talk to candidates who look nothing like you and look like me and every variation of me there could be. And I guarantee you, no one has ever said that to them. Is that scary and nerve-wracking? Yes, it makes me so nervous. But I know that if I don't take on that burden to be that person that says we need to hire more people of color, we need to hire people from we just hired someone who worked at SB Nation. That is nothing like Axios. And he is doing amazing work in his 2 months with us because he's bringing these different perspectives that we don't have currently in the newsroom. And it takes being bold, and I think that's what's difficult to see, is that not everyone feels comfortable doing that. But my hope is that by talking to our editors and the people at the top who are all white men and saying this is the type of diversity that we need to not only enhance the newsroom culture, but the things that we're covering and how we're covering them and how we're thinking about what is important and newsworthy. And that's something that I feel lucky to do, but that I think could solve the problem, is having people who are not just at the top or not just in HR saying, maybe we should hire more diverse people, but it's everyone at every level saying, I know this person who's really qualified, or this person from this state school.
So this is a great segue to what I want to ask about next. This idea of being bold, which is you, more power to you, empowering yourself and taking it upon yourself to change the conversation about how your newsroom works and what kind of things you want to cover. And that gets to my next question, which is an uncomfortable one in this still raw moment, but I hear it being whispered in my newsroom, and so I want to put it on the table. Can we go too far? Is it possible, in the service of wanting to create newsrooms that are inclusive, respectful, where everyone feels secure and comfortable, which of course we do, that the balance tips that not every slight amounts to harassment, that not every slight should be reported to HR. I hear this, and I will say, along generational lines, some of my older colleagues, male and female, saying, what happened to saying, knock it off, buddy, and back to work? Anybody? Carolyn, you want to take a swing at that and we'll work our way back?
Sure. I mean, I think my experiences in news were wonderful. I had some wonderful days and I had some bad experiences too. But overall, I still have a deep respect for the profession, and I think everything that we've heard on the stage today about the need to have better leaders and managers in newsrooms was part of the reason why I stepped aside, because I wanted to better understand what are the critical factors to create great organizations, including great leaders and managers. And here's what I found after thinking about it and working on some of these projects. Great managers are good at giving feedback and having delegation. Great cultures can communicate. They can talk about their problems. There's psychological safety, which is like a concept that basically means that people feel comfortable being themselves. It sounds like you have it at your company, which is great. The idea that you can share your ideas and you won't be punished. You can take interpersonal risk and you won't be punished. But journalism and many organizations don't have that. And you're not unique. It's across industries. And it's particularly in industries where we've seen harassment come to play too, where there's just a few positions of power and scarce roles for people to break into the profession, so they don't feel like they can use their voices. But in great organizations, which I think is critical for the newsrooms that everyone here on this stage has described, people need to be able to share their voices. So the question is, how do you create that psychological safety? And you do that through great managers and leaders and having conversations about the behaviors and competencies.
And do you think it needs to be codified in, I asked, because at NPR, at the end of my anti-harassment training on Monday, we were asked to read and sign a policy, date it, laying out exactly what NPR considers harassment, exactly who you can report to, and signing and initialing, my understanding that A, my claim might not be completely confidential because managers might need to investigate, and this might, your name might come out, and B, what is permitted and what is almost entirely not permitted in terms of retaliation if someone speaks forward, what a supervisor's responsibility is. Is that something that more newsrooms should consider codifying in that way?
It's definitely important to have at least something there, some guidance and some training, but that's just a start. I think what's more important is that people feel comfortable at least talking to somebody if something happens, that you can actually go into somebody's office and say, I don't know what this was, but I feel really uncomfortable. And I know at my firm at Booz Allen, they have been really, really good about training everybody. Just, it's not up to the manager or the leader to be judge and jury. You report it. If it's related to some sort of sexual harassment claim or even anything related to gender, I felt like he was kind of condescending to me because I'm a woman. They have a duty to report, and they accumulate the feedback and they deal with it. But feedback is also really critical, self-awareness and openness to feedback. Great leaders actually want it and seek it out, and if they're not getting it, they go and look for it. But I think that just the policies and the standards are a start. How that actually translates into experiences with harassment, I don't know back in the day if that would have helped me. Like, because the scenarios that come into play are so confusing and so overwhelming, and it's still painful to talk about. I don't think that any type of guideline could have prepared me. The only thing that really could have is if I truly understood how to recognize the behavior. And that really comes from different types of trainings, talking to people. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to know who to come to if you have a problem, no matter what it is in the workplace. And I think that's just like to create that type of safety. It's really simple. Like, newsroom leaders just need to say hi to people, be nice, be kind, so that if something does happen, they feel that they can come to you.
And
I want you to jump in. Let me just flag everybody in just a few minutes. I'm going to open it to questions. So if you want to make your way to the mic, feel free. And to repeat what Diana said at the beginning, I hear there's journalism students in the crowd. So the next generation is here. Raise your voices, please. Come ask questions. Everybody's welcome, but we'd love to hear from students. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Please, Karen.
Back to your question. I think maybe your question is, are we at risk of becoming humorless and overly sensitive, or, right? My feeling on that is that we have for a whole lot of years had the pendulum in the wrong place.
It's the other way, too far.
And if we, you know what, the pendulum's gonna have to swing the other way, and this is gonna be an evolving thing, and yeah, there are gonna be times, I mean, I had a conversation the other day with somebody who was complaining because this man was mansplaining to them about something that needed to happen or whatever, and I said, he's your boss, and he happens to be a man, and part of his job is he's going to occasionally have to explain to you what he wants you to do. So that's okay, right? So, but I was talking to some folks earlier, I have a 17-year-old son who is, and I now know the word, he's the most woke person I've ever met. He has 2 older sisters, and they've created this great kid, and he teaches me all the time about the pendulum, and my pendulum has been off on a lot of subjects. And it's, I hate what's happened that got us to this point, but I'm really thankful that we're at this point where we can have conversations with our kids and our colleagues and try to figure out where that pendulum's gonna land. But it's darn fine if it goes the other way too much for a little while.
I agree. I mean, Mary Louise, you said, is there a danger of going too far? Too far for who? You know, it's not going to be too far for everybody. Conversation is still going to be the most important thing. You have to, it's both and, right? It's harassment training, it's training for managers, it's creating a culture where people can talk to each other and being able to air differences. My daughters are almost 21 and almost 19, and we've had very lively discussions about this issue, which I'm sure we replicated in newsrooms with women of different generations. And opening the door to that conversation, I think, is what's really going to help us to get the pendulum back in a little more normal way.
I think that's, to put a finer point on my question, I think what I'm getting at is absolutely conversation, critical, clearly, but between who? Because I see a pendulum swinging, and maybe this is a great thing, but somebody says something that makes me uncomfortable. A year ago, my first thought would have been to say, knock it off, and can we focus on the story, please? And now it would cross my mind to say, I want to raise this with my supervisor. And she's going to escalate it to HR. Is that a good thing, always? Understanding we're dealing with areas where sometimes communication just between a colleague is...
Well, here's what I think helps us on this front is that, and I think everybody's touched on this, it gets to candor. We weren't having these conversations because we were afraid. So yes, everything you've said, I've discussed, and we've all discussed, whether it's around the dinner table or whether it's in newsrooms, and are we going too far, and is it fair, or is it not fair, are we going far enough? We need to talk about it because there isn't one straight answer. And I think the biggest failure was that we were afraid to address some of these conversations. I think the generational question that you raised is an important one. It's one that I've had with mentors of mine who are women that I've learned a lot of in my career, and that perspective is different than some women who work for me who are at a different point in their careers. And it doesn't make one right or wrong, but unless you have the perspective that there are different opinions at the table, and unless you're willing to challenge some of these questions and address whether or not the pendulum swung too far, you're not going to actually get to the root of the problem.
I really think it's important, too, that men and women can talk to each other. Yeah. One thing I really admire about men is, like, when they get mad at each other, they can have a little bit of conflict and just, get it out. And it's fine, there's candor, but sometimes when women hear something that offends them, they take it back, they sit on it for like 6 months to a year, and people have no idea that they've offended them. And this is not, I mean, and I'm guilty of this myself, so I say this as a woman. And I wish that earlier in my career I just would have been comfortable saying, that really offended me. But guys do that really well. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot that men and women can learn from each other. At the same time, men probably say things that they don't mean to, and the only way they'll ever know is if they have training and if their female colleagues say, like, you probably shouldn't have said that. And there's a difference between you probably shouldn't have said that and sexual harassment.
And if we teach our kids some of those different modeling, right? What are we teaching our sons versus our daughters about when it's okay to speak up and and have conflict and when is it not?
Questions? We're going to open it to the floor. Please state your name. If you have an affiliation you want to share, great. And please keep your question a question. Yes.
Hi. I'm Ari Wolpenfeld, and I've been a sexual harassment attorney for about 20 years, and I kind of want to address my question to you all as journalists. We're sitting in this building, which is a monument to the power and importance of the media in effectuating change. I think we've seen that play out over the Me Too movement. Us attorneys have been able to get media coverage of superstar harassers. But there's so much more harassment going on in this country. You wouldn't believe what happens to, say, undocumented workers working on a farm. How do we get the media to start covering those stories as well so that we can demonstrate to every industry and every potential harasser that no one's safe, anyone can be covered, anyone can be exposed?
Great question. Anybody want to take a swing?
Well, you know, the oxygen is being sucked up every day in different ways by different stories. This is also something I think about a lot, right? There are a lot of very important stories that are going undertold or underreported, especially here in DC because of everything coming out of the White House and the administration. I think it is seeing the continued work that a lot of great journalists are doing on these topics. I think it's pushing ourselves and reminding ourselves, like, yes, we had this very strong Me Too moment where we were all reporting on different aspects of this. I did a little bit of reporting on sexual harassment on political campaigns. That's something that I think about every week, and I'm like, this is a story I should continue with because it certainly has not ended. I think it's continuing to have these conversations, but it's tough, right? It's tough, and I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer for that other than just continuing to poke and prod and bring it to people's attention. And also, you know, to show them examples of these things that are happening. Because I think we can all say, like, yes, sexual harassment is happening in every industry, got it. But until you're presented with the facts and the stories, I think that's when it becomes really compelling. And you sort of say, like, I will drop everything else to report on this and bring this to light.
I actually think that the sort of Hollywoodization of the story has opened up room for other industries and for news organizations to report on them. I think, you know, the Times did a fantastic story on an assembly line in a Ford plant. NewsHour did a story on the Forest Service. I think these are stories that you wouldn't have even thought about a year ago. So I think using this as an opening, and I think that probably gives courage to some women when they read that, wow, if Ashley Judd couldn't deal with it or Lupita Nyong'o had a hard time with it, you know, I feel like, okay, so it's not just me. So I hope that, you know, newsrooms and assignment editors can see those openings to expand their coverage.
Yeah. And not as a solution, but as an acknowledgement of the point that we just raised, trying to get the oxygen to cover a story in the news environment in 2018. I mean, the news cycle is insane beyond anything I have ever seen. And I think it took a story of the egregious, just appallingness of Harvey Weinstein for this to break through and get momentum. Hoping we don't see that, obviously, in other industries in quite the same way, but in terms of why that has gotten the coverage and traction it did, the combination of just, it was black and white. This was just bad. And very prominent women who gave it a voice.
And your point is particularly disheartening when we consider that the President of the United States is getting wall-to-wall coverage of his own accusations of sexual assault and harassment, which is shutting out and taking away more oxygen, as we were saying, from these stories that need to be told. Like, these are all things that I realize, and I hope that I can do my part in focusing on these other stories, but it is tough, and that's another frustrating aspect of all of it.
Thank you. Here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Keisuke Katori from the Asahi Shimbun, Japanese daily newspaper. And thank you for exciting discussion. But your discussion mostly focused on the sexual harassment inside the newsroom, but I'm very curious about sexual harassment from the outside the newsroom. It means that between reporters and their resources. So listen that a couple days ago, top bureaucrats on Ministry of Finance of Japan resigned because the sexual allegation against the reporter, the TV reporter. The TV reporter accused that leaks the record voice, record conversation between that top bureaucrat and her, and that conversation occurred in the recording interview occasion. So that is very buzzing in Japan. So do you have any similar case in US, and how do you deal with that case?
Did you all get the question? Okay. Do you want to take a first whack at it?
Yeah, I think it is a problem, and I think it's more of a problem than what we know. It should be unacceptable for reporters to face any sort of harassment like that in the course of trying to do their jobs, whether it's in the newsroom or out of the newsroom. And I think it happens probably at newsrooms of all sizes. The problem is, as we mentioned a little bit before, is that if a reporter brings that to the attention of a company or a school board president or whatever the person who's being interviewed, it can have such an adverse effect on the reporter that I think that often these things go unreported. I think my newsroom has a slightly, we need to have more conversations about it, but I think when you're working for the Wall Street Journal or you're working for CNN, the power of our organizations protects our reporters in a way, potentially, that reporters at smaller organizations who maybe aren't as well known and who don't have the backing, the financial ability, and the in-house legal team, and the folks who can protect and can go after that company for the behavior. I worry a lot about reporters in places that don't have the resources of the major newsrooms, but it's happening more than I think I know about. It's my guess.
Last question, and can I say thank you to all the men for lining up at the mics?
No problem. Last question. Thank you all for being here. So obviously, like, culture starts from at the top. Great example of that is the White House currently, obviously. I'm just wondering if you guys have seen any like positive cultural shifts that haven't necessarily started at the top that have made change inside the organization.
You mean positive changes unfolding in newsrooms, but that are coming from,
like
not from the top ranks of management, but bottom up?
Correct. Yeah.
We're seeing that all the time, and it gets back to one of the points I made earlier, where it's the notion of intentional leadership. We have leaders in the organization, men and women, frankly, who have said we need to work on aspects of our culture, again, for a lot of the reasons we discussed, and it's been really wonderful to watch. There's a manager who works within the CNN digital organization who said, you know what, we ought to be having a conversation about unconscious bias because that's something we don't deal with enough in newsrooms. And so she, on her own, without a committee or a panel or something coming down from on high, has pulled together people throughout the organization, and they're having meetings now weekly about unconscious bias. And now that that exists, we're taking that and saying, okay, what can we do to amplify that? What can we do to extend that out? And that's really what I mean by intentional leadership. We are all on the hook, and leadership does come from the top, but it has been gratifying to see that in our organization. I'd add, too, that it can't just be women. It can't only be women in organizations, to your point earlier, advocating to bosses who in many cases are white men about the need for change. You need men in organizations too who are willing to tackle this at all levels.
Yeah. I mean, I'll answer at NPR, one of the most hopeful signs to me has been raised by temps in the newsroom. We hire a lot of temps because news is an unpredictable business, and also, frankly, because it's been cheaper in past. They haven't gotten the same benefits and training as our permanent staff. The point being, these are people not with the most senior voices in the food chain by a long shot. And they have made their voices heard saying, this has to change. We want to get the same training. We want to get the same mentoring. We're working in this newsroom, and we don't want to be harassed any more than the permanent staffers fix it. We haven't fixed it, but we have made progress. There have been meetings, all staffs where the CEO I have watched getting grilled by temps in their 20s. And it has led to change, including a couple of women who I personally have mentored who in these last few months have graduated from years of being temps to being permanent staffers. And those are happy days, and they're starting near the bottom. Final thoughts? Anybody? Closing thought? On that note, I will thank all of you. Thanks to Carolyn, to Madalika, to Andrew, to Alexi, to Karen. Thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who wants to speak first?
Just wanted a quick word for those of you joining us for the reception afterwards at the 6th floor. Please exit at the bottom left of the theater and take the glass elevators to level 6. And I just think it's wonderful that we've had this beginning of a conversation. We want to keep these going. I think it's also important for everybody in the room to understand that we're talking about the newsrooms, but this can be any industry. I mean, this really is a cross-sectional issue at a time when we know this isn't just newsrooms, it's happening everywhere. So we can be the leaders in these conversations. We can come back with a blueprint, hopefully, and we can hopefully translate that across other industries. So thank you very much for coming.